Good evening from Beirut, where unfortunately, appropriately, it is raining. I'm Chloe Cornish. I'm the Middle East I'm the Financial Times correspondent for the Middle East, based in Beirut. 1,000 Lebanese were recently surveyed by the Arab Barometer Project. About 3/4 of them said that either banking and financial reforms or reducing inequality and poverty should be the top priorities for the next government. The economic crisis is Lebanon's biggest problem, despite the fact that the explosion was one of the most horrific things that could possibly be imagined. In the best case scenario, people are seeing their money become worthless and the price of their food double, triple, quadruple. In the worst case scenario, they're losing their jobs and their homes. Poverty is climbing to affect about half of the population of Lebanon. And despite these extremely real and present dangers to people's livelihoods, there's still no new government. It's 5 months since Hassan Diab's government resigned after the port disaster. Parliamentary Speaker Nabi Berri this week more or less said Lebanon's politicians were waiting for the arrival of French President Emmanuel Macron to come and help corral them into a new government. Perhaps it's no wonder then that the World Bank, which is not exactly known for its hyperbole, called this a deliberate depression. So to discuss this fiendish crisis, the possible ways it could get worse and the possible ways out, we have Paul Salem. He's president of the Middle East Institute in Washington and was the founding director of Carnegie's Middle East Center here in Beirut. Before he went into the private sector as an economist, we have Nasser Saidi, who has served 2 terms as vice governor of Lebanon's central bank. He also spent 2 years as a minister of economy and trade and industry. Randa Takieddine is the Lebanese journalist based in Paris. She's specialized in France's relations with the Middle East. She's also very good on Lebanese politics, and she was the former Al Hayat bureau chief in Paris. Emile Hokayem has been an analyst at the International Institute for Strategic Studies for the last 10 years, focusing on Middle East security. Paul, I'll turn to you first. 5 months on, we still don't have a new government, and the game looks more or less the same as usual. Why are the political classes so resilient in Beirut, and why are they so resistant to changing their ways?
A couple of things. I mean, first of all, they're not, I think, as resilient and powerful as they appear, but in the absence of fresh elections, they remain in control of parliament and hence in control of all the levers of power. Having said that, yes, they are an entrenched elite or an entrenched oligarchy built on a sort of a political compromise that was put in place after the end of the Civil War in 1990 and has kind of governed the political and economic structure of the country for the last 30 years. Keep in mind also that this oligarchy is elected and re-elected. These figures were just elected or re-elected 2 years ago. And this partly explains their strength, because when you have repeated elections, they always have to keep fresh their patronage networks, their political influence in the regions and in the villages. So they're not a detached oligarchy. They're pretty well entrenched. Another point to keep in mind is that in the 3 main communities, if you wish, there is also kind of a communal existential aspect to this leadership. Hezbollah obviously represents the resistance originally against the Israeli occupation of the south, the revival of Shiite power in the Middle East, which hasn't been at this apogee for 7 centuries. So they really represent something very profound within the Shiite community. Within the Sunni community, Saad al-Hariri is the scion or the heir of the great martyr of the Sunni community, Rafi al-Hariri. So he also has a sort of communal existential presence. And Michel Aoun, the aging Michel Aoun, represented from 30 years ago the Maronite trauma of loss of dominance of the political system, a bit like Trump, you know, make Maronite Lebanon great again, has a great hold on a section of the Maronite and Christian community. So it's a complicated scene, but I would just summarize by saying that this oligarchy certainly has been under now serious threat and challenge since the uprising of October 2019. And when I look forward to 2021, I look to the further mobilization and organization of the Lebanese citizenry, the Lebanese polity, which really has been pretty dormant in the past 20, 30 years and let the oligarchy kind of rule. But now that the economy has collapsed and the country has collapsed, you see enormous citizen activism. And I'm looking to 2021, particularly as the pandemic hopefully recedes, that hopefully we can see a resurgence of national protest and an insistence on elections in the spring of 2022. And maybe that momentum of national protest, unification, demand for change with an election, and hopefully in spring of 2022 would actually begin to bring political change. Those are some opening thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks for kicking us off there, Paul. Really interesting. It struck me from what you were saying, what a huge disappointment a lot of these leaders have actually been to each of their communities as well. They all came in with great hopes for change at one point in their histories and have really failed to deliver on that. To take us across to the kind of economic sphere of things, Nasser, we've been warned multiple times by the IMF, by the World Bank, so many different bodies that Lebanon has to enact reforms in order to get itself on a stable footing and be able to revive its economy. Could you take us through what economic reforms are needed to bring Lebanon back from the brink? And can you give us a sense of how possible it is that these will actually happen?
Well, you're right in your initial comments to talk about the current policy stance, which is adequately described by the World Bank as being a deliberate depression. This is real deflation, i.e. the imposition of an inflation tax that reduces people's income and people's wealth, lirification, that is the gradual conversion of dollar and foreign currency deposits into Lebanese pound deposits. And effectively, all of that is leading to a deleveraging of the banking and financial system. Remember that Lebanon, at the end of 2019 and also 2020, has one of the highest, the third highest debt to GDP ratio in the world. So what is happening now, in effect, is a bail-in of the banks at the expense of depositors and the general population. Now, what do you need to do about that? There's a number of reforms, and these have been discussed with the IMF. Let me take broadly what it is. And the first point, I think, to note that you cannot go piecemeal. What you need is a comprehensive macroeconomic, fiscal, financial, plus structural reforms. So if you look at other countries that have been in crisis, Greece, Argentina, Iceland, and others, this goes way beyond that. We're seeing real GDP declining in 2020 by about 20%, had already declined by 7% in 2019. So this is a massive depression that we're talking about, even greater than what we saw in the 1930s and the Great Depression. So what do you need to do? First, a comprehensive macro, fiscal, financial reform plan. That means several things. It means you've got to restructure the public debt. That means reducing its value in present value terms from an economist's point of view. And you've got to restructure the banking sector, which is a big holder of government debt. And that includes also restructuring the central bank. At the same time, you've got to think about the fiscal reform. And that has several dimensions to it. And it means tax reform, it means government procurement reform, it means dealing with the pension systems. Remember that with inflation, many people who thought they had retirement benefits and pensions have seen that melt down. This is similar to the end of the Soviet Union, where people who had been working for 30, 40 years suddenly found themselves dispossessed because of inflation. And so the fiscal reform is going to be the core, along with the banking and financial sector reform. in terms of the banking and financial sector, the immediate things that needs to happen is a Capital Control Act that needs to be passed immediately. Because in the meantime, with the financial crisis happening, there have been continuous outflows out of Lebanon, which has meant that your financial meltdown is continuing while those who are able to get their money out are getting it out. And that means there are fewer dollars. The reserves of the central bank are declining very, very rapidly. You need to stop the central bank financing government, and stopping all quasi-fiscal spending. That means stopping the central bank from providing subsidies. Subsidy reform has got to be another important one. So you've got capital controls, removing subsidies and replacing them with cash directly to the impoverished citizens. And you're talking about more than 55% now are in poverty, 25% are in extreme food poverty. So a number of reforms. And of course, Lebanon is not able to undertake that itself. You've now got as well the destruction of the port, you've got very poor infrastructure. So you've got to do two things. You've got to have a multilateral economic stabilization and liquidity program. And that has to be under the supervision of the IMF, within an IMF program. What are we talking about in terms of size? For the macro stabilization and liquidity fund, Lebanon is going to need something like 25 to 30 billion. That's going to have to come from the international community. In the absence of that, you're not going to be able to rebuild infrastructure. You're not going to be able to get the economy going again. On the banking side, you need a recapitalization and restructuring of the banking sector. The estimated cost of that is around $25 billion. What is needed there is a bail-in of the banking sector, by which I mean a bail-in by the shareholders who have benefited from financial engineering and the Ponzi scheme that was run by the central bank and that paid enormous interest rates to deposits by the banks and their shareholders and some large depositors.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're talking about is a comprehensive package that is required.
Mm.
So restructure the banking financial sector, restructure public debt, undertake fiscal reforms, get the international community to come and support that. And of course, the international community is only going to come in if they see that Lebanon's politicians are committed to reform.
Right.
So far, they have not been committed to reform. They haven't been willing to, say, remove banking secrecy, conduct an audit of the central bank, and the list goes on.
Yeah.
So none of the reforms are likely to happen unless there is pressure on the Lebanese politicians.
Right.
So I'm an advocate of sanctions on all Lebanese politicians, the freezing of their assets until such time as they come around to accepting the need for reforms.
Okay.
So the current outlook for 2021 is not inspiring. It is one in which, if we continue kicking the can down the road, you'll have mass migration out of Lebanon, and the failed state will end up being a completely collapsed economy and financial system.
Okay, thanks, Nasser, for that. There's some very sobering thoughts in there, especially about the kind of loss of pensions and some comparisons with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I think we'll come back to that sanctions point that you raised, because that's quite it's quite a drastic measure, possibly. Nasser has touched upon the fact that without the international community, Lebanon can't really expect to be able to get out of this. Randa, you're in Paris and you're talking with the Elysee frequently about Lebanon. So the French have been leading this initiative, the so-called French initiative, trying to drum up support for Lebanon, but constantly finding that Lebanon isn't really doing much to help this effort at the moment, or the Lebanese politicians aren't. Why are the French trying to keep this initiative alive? I mean, what's the point? What's in it for them?
The point is, first, Macron's third visit now, next week, is no exception to other French presidents of the Fifth Republic of France. They all were involved in Lebanon during crisis. Since de Gaulle, they all were involved. Why? Because Lebanon is important for the public opinion of France. It was always popular among the French because of the Christian community of Lebanon, because of social and cultural attachment to this country. And Emmanuel Macron is no exception to other presidents who got involved in Lebanon. Now, on the news of the Beirut port explosion, he did not hesitate to interrupt his vacation in Fort Brégançon to go to Beirut on the 6th of August and show the people of Lebanon French solidarity. His involvement in putting this French initiative stems from his conviction that the country is collapsing with huge economic, financial, and political problems, and Macron is a voluntarist. He thought he could obtain from the political leadership a credible government that will do reforms that Nasser just mentioned that they should be done. So after the dramas that hit the country, he thought he can mobilize international aid to save the people. Now he's visiting for the third time, and there is no government formed, and the situation is really dramatic. Why is he continuing, you would tell me? When you talk to French officials, you understand that in their analysis, if France stops getting involved in Lebanon, France and Europe and the West will be excluded from the great geopolitical chessboard of the Mediterranean, where Turkey, Russia, and Iran are prevailing, actually. France has no role in Syria, for example. It's marginalized by agreements between Russia, Moscow, and Ankara, and the Iranian player, of course. In Libya, the same. It's Russia and Turkey. So if the French leave now and they say, okay, we failed, we can't do anything, this is really, it's for him a failure, a personal failure in the public opinion and on the European scene.
Thanks, Randa. That's quite some psychodrama that's going on for Emmanuel Macron when it comes to Lebanon. Thank you very much for that insight and also for broadening it out to France's regional policy as well. Very interesting to hear about that. To continue with the regional politics, Emile, is anyone in the region coming to rescue Lebanon?
Well, good evening. Well, this is certainly what many Lebanese are hoping for. Some divine, selfless intervention from some wealthy, magnanimous Gulf country in particular, with no or very few strings attached. The reality is that it won't happen. Lebanese politicians in particular grew addicted to their regional connections and to basically milking those connections for local gain and to strengthen their own positions. But the reality is that the changes in Lebanon in the past decade, the changes in the Gulf states in particular, and the changes in the Arab Gulf state-Lebanon relationship have been massive and profound. And now the Lebanese, whether it's at political or at a popular level, have to reckon with that and adjust to that. And in the past, the Gulf attachment to Lebanon was taken for granted for valid reasons in a way. It was real. It was personal. It was emotional. It was cultural. It was political. Lebanon, essentially provided entertainment for much of the region. It had politics and it had television. So basically, it was entertainment for Arab publics who, were interested in seeing some action in the region. And Lebanon was always among the top 3, top 5 issues for the Gulf states in particular. But things have changed really, really massively. I mean, first, what the Gulf states in particular have learned is that involvement in Lebanon is very costly and bruising, and there's never a clear outcome, regardless of the size and the nature of the investment. Only complex compromises that the Arab Gulf states had been asked in the past to, in a way, subsidize. They're done with that. They also learned that their interests in Lebanon cannot be met and cannot be secured by their Lebanese clients. I mean, in Saudi, but also elsewhere, people realize that the Lebanese states nor the Hokayem dynasty can do much about Hezbollah's support, for instance, for the Houthis right now in Yemen. And that goes to the heart of Gulf national security. And finally, the entanglement with Lebanese politicians has been quite bruising. The Gulf leaders have felt manipulated. They put a lot of money into that. They put a lot of face time. They indulged these actors. But at this point, there's no return on investment, and the sense is always that they come back for more. So in a way, nothing works, and honestly, like the way Saudis, Emiratis, Kuwaitis, others talk about their investment in the Hokayem dynasty is quite telling. Now, let's broaden just for a minute this analysis. 10 years ago, the competition in Lebanon did matter in terms of the regional balance of power. But now, with Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and a few other countries on fire, and where there's intense competition, Lebanon, with its 4 or 5 million citizens and additional refugees, is much less important. There's also a sense, a widely shared sense, that while there is factions vying with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the government is essentially controlled, or at least limited, constrained by Hezbollah and by extension Iran. And everyone refers to, for instance, to the 2016 decisions by Lebanon to not vote in favor of stemming Iran after the attacks against the Saudi consulate and thing in Iran, an embassy in Iran, which was a turning point for a lot of people here in the region. Lebanon is also increasingly seen as a source of threat to the Gulf states, whether it's Hezbollah and assumed desire to manipulate and provoke or mount attacks or spy on behalf of the Iranians, describing the perception in those countries, or others. I mean, so there's immense frustration here. But there's also something, perhaps more profound, that for 30, 40 years, Lebanese talent was highly appreciated and rewarded in the Gulf states. And the Lebanese were quite central in the economic and national development of these countries. This is no longer the case. There is a supply of talent coming from other countries. They provide the languages, the technical expertise, the interactions with other countries, and so on. And Lebanese are seen as a bit passé, overly arrogant, and that have taken the region for granted for too long. And finally, on this point, is that there is generational change at an elite level. There are new leaders in the Gulf states who are less personally, emotionally, culturally, politically attached to Lebanon. Compare King Fahd or King Abdullah or Saud al-Faisal to Mohammed bin Salman, Faisal bin Farhan, or some of the other Saudi leadership right now, including King Salman for that matter. They didn't go to Grumana High School. Their best friends are not Lebanese. Their closest advisors are not it. Sheikh Sabah of Kuwait, who just passed away, Emile, was one of the most involved in trying to, during the civil war in Lebanon and afterwards. And the new generation in the Kuwaiti leadership is not as attached to Lebanon's future. So that, and in the UAE has essentially written off Lebanon for the moment, at least politically, until they see a profound change in the country's strategic orientation. So the Gulf states have more and other priorities, and they don't want to be taken for granted They don't want, they actually resent this sense that they will come in to bail out Lebanon again. And look at, for instance, the Saudi and UAE representation at some of these donor conferences. They tend to be quite junior compared to the past, when they were some of the most senior people around the table. So you know, it's a very the long history of Lebanese Gulf relations is now going to deliver the magical solution that some in Beirut are still hoping for.
Okay. All right. It's good to hear from you, Emile, about the kind of disillusionment that is happening over in the Gulf with some of Lebanon's political leaders. I think we're going to step back now into the kind of economic part of things, because from here in Beirut, that feels very present and urgent right now. And one particular factor feels particularly worrying, and that's the end of subsidies. So the central bank governor, Riyad Salameh, has now warned sort of multiple times over the course of this year, but these calls are getting slightly more scary, that the sort of subsidy scheme that the central bank effectively runs, where it provides dollars for essential imports at the official pegged rate of 1,500 rather than the black market rate of 8,000. He said that he's going to run out of reserves to be able to support that. When that happens, we're assuming that we are going to see even further inflation and big price rises. So Nasser, I want to ask you, as we're looking forward into 2021, how big of a problem is the potential lifting of the subsidies by the central bank?
Well, it could be a major problem, particularly if you remove them suddenly without an alternative. It means rising prices for many items. But this was a misguided policy to begin with. If you look at the current subsidies, they're running in terms of cost about $4.5 billion per year. About 50% of that goes for fuel, mazout, diesel, and the rest. And then you've got some medicines and some wheat and other. However, all the indicators are, and the surveys are, that only 20% of that actually goes to the poor and needy, right? 80% of the subsidies goes to traders, middlemen, and the like, and to smuggling into Syria. Remember that Syria is under sanctions. It has been under several years under sanctions. And recently, you've got the Caesar Act, which is now impinging even more on Syria, which is in deep crisis itself. So what you're seeing is that if you take fuel and energy, 2/3 of the imports are actually ending up in Syria, not in Lebanon. So what Lebanon has been doing is, in fact, subsidizing Syria in terms of wheat, fuel, medicines, and the other. And incredibly enough, some of those subsidized items are ending up in supermarkets in the Gulf countries. Now, so this is a misguided policy to begin with. What you need to do is to reform that and to replace that with a cash program as part of a social safety net for the poorest Lebanese. That's been estimated by the World Bank at about $1.6 billion. So instead of spending the $4.4 billion, which is currently being spent, you could spend $1.6 billion and cover something like 100% of the consumption spending of the poorest segments, some 70 to 80% of the next poor, and up to 60% of the others. So you're going to be covering a good part of the Lebanese providing Lebanese dollars at the subsidized rates. That's been very attractive. It's multiple exchange rate systems, which always invite corruption. And of course, anybody who can get access to dollars at 1,505 would love to get it. But who's been getting it? It's not the poor. It's been the rich, the traders, and everybody else. And of course, the politicians who are involved as well and protecting the smuggling into Syria. So what you need to do is to stop that policy and, in general, stop quasi-fiscal operations by the central bank. It is not the business of the central bank to be providing subsidies or even financing subsidies. That should be part of the government budget. So let the politicians bear the responsibility. You're going to have to lift subsidies in any case. Do that. You start with fuel, but at the same time, you put in this cash program It can be done through smart, intelligent cards with biometrics or mobile phone applications. The World Bank knows how to do that. The UN knows how to do that. They do that in a number of countries, particularly for Syrian refugees in Jordan and elsewhere. So we know how to put it in place. Now, of course, that means that you want policymakers who are able to do so and are willing to do so. So far, they haven't been listening to economic reason. They are populists. They're trying to use subsidies as a way to continue the current system, and that means a way for them to extract even more of the reserves of the central bank. So what you need is radical reform, the introduction of a social safety net. Lebanon has just signed an agreement with the World Bank to provide something like $400 million. The total package is 1.6 billion. That can be done very quickly. And so this is where you want the international community to intervene. If Monsieur Macron comes and visits us next week, I would put capital controls, an audit of the central bank, and removal of subsidies and reform of subsidies as one of the main items, along with reform of the EDL, the Électricité du Liban. Those should be very much on the policy agenda.
Nasser, I can't help but ask you where you got some of that from. I mean, the part about the Syria smuggling, I think we all think there's a lot going on, but you gave some very kind of specific figures. Can you give us,
well,
can you tell us where you got
easy.
those numbers
It's very easy. Yeah, sure, it's very easy. If you look at total imports of fuel, mazout, benzene, and all the rest, it's 3 times Lebanon's annual consumption. So it's not disappearing into reserves in the earth. It's going across the border. So 1/3 stays in Lebanon, 2/3 goes across the border. And all you need to do is to send a drone over the border with Syria, and you'll see them.
Okay.
These are very easy numbers.
I think this takes us on an interesting segue towards Syria, which, as you alluded to, Nasser, is having a huge crisis of its own. Emile, in the context of regional relations, what kind of interaction is there likely to be between the Syrian crisis and the Lebanese crisis next year? We often get very caught up with the idea that this is a refugee crisis and that that's how these two countries interact with each other. But is there more than that? Is there an economic dimension as well to the way that these two countries interact with each other?
Well, there's both an economic and a political dimension to it.
Sorry, Nasser, I'm turning to Emile with this one.
Sorry? Yeah, Emile, sure.
Well, I mean, certainly, as Dr. Saidi just mentioned, the two countries are intertwined economically, but also politically. And I think that, the crisis in Syria has been amplified by the wars in Lebanon. But in a way, the crisis in Lebanon will only get worse if Syria can only rely on Lebanon for its, main imports and so on. The other point here politically is that, in a way, for Syria, for the Syrian government to get back in the game of regional politics, winning some points in Lebanon will matter. I mean, Lebanon is a way to tell, Gulf countries, the Europeans and others, like, you want yet another failed state. We can be part of, a solution there if you, loosen up on our end. I mean, there are some early signs that Damascus is thinking along this way, like to present the crisis as intertwined. But I think there's just too much dissonance and divergences between the crisis and so on that, one should certainly not see them as, completely in sync. And certainly the solutions have to be very, very distinct there. Although those both would require fundamental political change and new regional understandings. So, I mean, I suspect that 2021 will be a painful year for both countries, where some of the hard decisions will be, evaded. Political elites in Damascus and Beirut will, try to buy time again, just as conditions deteriorate for everyone in both countries. The the real question for me is more on a regional front, which is, will we see a continuation of tensions, between the U.S. and Iran, and would that actually affect everything else, or would a Biden-driven re-engagement of Iran somehow provide some space for Lebanon and Syria to start focusing on their own problems and withdraw a little bit from the regional competition? Despite being a very young man, I'm quite pessimistic about that. It's perhaps the nature of my job.
Thanks, Emile. That's really, really interesting. On the Biden question, Paul, do you think with this incoming administration, we're going to see a continuation of a Middle East policy that's sort of all based around Iran, where other countries in the region, including Lebanon, are kind of appendages to that policy? Or do you think we're going to see something that's more country specific? And will that be good or bad for Lebanon in terms of the attention that the US is going to give it given the scale of the problems that the US is facing itself right now?
Well, first of all, I would say vis-a-vis the Trump administration and its policy towards Lebanon, it was actually had several components, and it was not all about Iran. And we'll break it down. The U.S. Defense Department is the main supporter of the Lebanese army. Training, finance, coordination, they work together, they fight together. They fought ISIS and Al-Qaeda pockets in the Biqa' with U.S. support. So there's a Pentagon-Lebanese army relationship which is very solid, very strong, very positive, and has really almost nothing to do with the Iran card. Secondly, in Congress, I would say, and in the administration, both in the White House and in the State Department, there is an awareness of the refugee burden that Lebanon is carrying, and the U.S. has been the biggest supporter in terms of funding of the Syrian refugee situation in Lebanon. And the Trump administration as well has been very forthright to the Lebanese government in saying that the U.S. is, the U.S. was part of the donor conference that President Macron assembled, and the U.S. has consistently said over the past year that the U.S. is willing to help, is certainly willing to use its influence in the IMF, provided that the Lebanese government or a Lebanese government undertakes the absolutely necessary reforms, many of which Dr. Saidi has just listed, that if the Lebanese government, regardless of Hezbollah and whatnot, does its essential homework on the economic side, that the U.S. would be cooperative, would encourage the IMF and others to engage. On Hezbollah, definitely this Trump administration has been more hardline, has imposed more sanctions, and has used sanctions in Lebanon and obviously on Iran, has extended those sanctions beyond Hezbollah's immediate, members and so on, most prominently to Gibran Bassil, who is sort of the president behind the scenes, if you will. So that's new. There might also still be a bunch of sanctions that come before Trump leaves office. We don't know how that's going to play out. But at the same time, the U.S., while sanctioning Hezbollah and then using Magnitsky Act corruption legislation to sanction others, keep in mind, has continued to recognize the Lebanese government and the Lebanese state, which obviously parliament has Hezbollah members, the government has had Hezbollah members. So to start with, it's a more nuanced policy than one assumes. The Biden administration will maintain those three pillars, the relationship with the army, the positive engagement on refugees, the positive engagement with any Lebanese government that's willing to undertake serious reforms, and will continue to try to put pressure on Hezbollah partly through sanctions. Biden is not going to lift, certainly not quickly, sanctions. What's different, and we'll see how this plays out, is that the Biden administration definitely wants to engage in negotiation with Iran over return into the nuclear agreement and then on other fronts. So it's likely that the Biden administration will be in talks with the Iranians, hence indirectly with Hezbollah, and that might enable some, deal making to put together a government and so on. But unfortunately, I don't think that will open the way for major change or major reform. Hezbollah looks at its position in Lebanon as as part and parcel of its presence in Syria. It's not obviously by mistake that a lot of our materials go to support Syria, because as far as Iran is concerned, the Lebanese and Syrian space for them is their way to put pressure on Israel and the United States, and they don't see them as separate. And that brings us to the fundamental flaw in the Lebanese state, is that it is a state that doesn't have sovereignty. We don't control our borders. We don't control our airport. We don't control the port. We cannot collect electricity tariffs. We are in thrall to a foreign, a domestic army that follows an external force. I will end by saying that Hezbollah is very good at playing this game. You will note that when Hezbollah got into trouble in 2020 with the collapse of the economy, the Beirut blast, and a wave of sanctions coming from Trump's administration, what did they do? They opened talks with the Israelis, which is the Achilles heel, or is kryptonite for the Americans. Like, okay, as long as you talk with the Israelis, then we're okay with you. And keep in mind that Hezbollah, in effect, is currently in talks with the Israelis indirectly, and that will play out in the Biden administration as well. That's a long answer to say that there will be some change, but I don't expect dramatic improvement in the Lebanese scene.
All right. Following on from that, we've got a question from the audience, and thank you everyone for putting your questions in the chat. I am watching them and we're going to integrate them as we go along. There's a question about the foreign influence effectively on the formation of the government. Randa, I'm going to turn to you with this one. What kind of foreign interference do you think there is in the formation of this government, if there is any? And what should we be expecting to see in 2021 in terms of any kind of foreign or regional interference in the progress of this new, if there is a new government? How do you think a very detailed kind of interference on Lebanese domestic politics from outside will impact the country in 2021?
The French initiative succeeds and materializes. In fact, it won't be a negative interference. It's going to be actually it will lead to a government that is that should be a credible government, that should have international aid, which means that they would have to do the reforms that Nasser just spoke about, and that the French are reiterating all the time. This audit of the central bank, the Électricité du Liban, all this, what Nasser mentioned now, they're on the paper of the French initiative, on the requests by the French that the government should do in order to have the IMF and the World Bank and all the international community to come and help and get Lebanon out of the crisis. Also, I want to add something. With all this disaster and the drama and everything, I hear that President Macron said to the Egyptian president that he was still hopeful. He was very shocked with the quality of the Lebanese politicians, but that he will not stop because he was still hopeful, and that the sanctions, putting sanctions on this political class, is not really in the cards now for the French, because they think that the sanctions, the American sanctions, have not helped. Also, I would like to say that historically speaking, the French succeeded only when they had American backing with them in Lebanon. If you recall, for example, the 1559 that got the Syrians out of Lebanon was done because there was a reconciliation between the Americans and the French, between George W. Bush and Jacques Chirac, on after the Iraqi war. Remember, the French had refused the Iraqi war, had vetoed to participate in the war against Saddam Hussein, but then the reconciliation happened on Lebanon. And my belief and analysis as a correspondent in France for years, that France would be boosted when US is helping. The Trump administration has not helped really. These sanctions were never coordinated with the French. They were never discussed with the French, and they didn't do anything, but they did not. Another coordination that happened between the French and the Americans on Lebanon that succeeded was getting Saad al-Hariri out of Saudi Arabia in 2017 when Macron got him out. The Americans were involved also. Don't believe they were not involved. I mean, Macron played the essential role, but the Americans played the role. Also, the Cèdre conference, they could not do a conference. Of course, the Lebanese failed this conference, but it was really a fantastic operation. It was French, but coordinated also with the Americans.
Thanks, Randa. That's some very interesting thoughts, especially about sanctions and their role. Nasser made a very bold statement earlier on, so I just want to see a show of hands from the panel. I think we can do this with technology. Who thinks that Nasser's idea is a good one, that should use sanctions as a way to enforce reforms from Lebanese politicians? Who on the panel, raise your hand if you think that's a good idea.
Well, I think it should be coordinated with a diplomatic plan. I think, part of the Trump administration's failure with Iran was it gained enormous leverage through sanctions, but did not have intelligent, forward-leaning diplomacy to get something to show for it. So just, haphazard sanctions hurts, but doesn't necessarily get a result. But sanctions are very powerful and very effective. So as part of an intelligent strategy to get Lebanon to a certain point, I would be hopeful. I want to comment on what Randa said, that yes, that's very important that the US and France work together. And the incoming, hopefully, Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, grew up in France. He's half French. And I think we'll see a lot of American-French coordination. I also think that they should figure out not only to have the Europeans and the Americans coordinating, but we must get some of the big Gulf countries back on game. We got to figure out a game that works, and we can't do it without the Gulf. So that's a lot of heavy lifting. Sorry, Chloe, that was a long raising of hand.
That's all right. I just want to suggest
Chloe,
that not everyone agrees that sanctions are as effective as you're saying they are, Paul. I mean, we see with Syria, for example, which is another country that I cover, that sanctions have been levied against the Syrian regime for a very long time, but it hasn't stopped necessarily. And Emile, I don't want to make this a conversation about Syria, but it hasn't had the kind of direct impact on changing behaviors. So do we really think that sanctions are the answer here? And also, should international interference in Lebanon be that heavy-handed? I mean, this is still a sovereign country.
Chloe, I mean, there are two separate issues to my mind. One is using sanctions for political reforms. That's one aspect. There's another one, which is a stolen asset recovery program, right? Which we need. Remember that a big part of the problem, fiscal problem in Lebanon, is corruption and corruption related. and the politicians need to be held accountable for what they've done. I mean, they've effectively destroyed Lebanon. They're now holding Lebanon hostage, waiting maybe for the international community to want to help on humanitarian and maybe hopefully on a wider program. So part of the sanctions is really part, to my mind, part of stolen asset recovery. And that's worth, by my count, at least 20 to 25 billion, right? So we're talking about large amounts of money. The second point about whether or not it was effective, I agree, it has not been effective so far because, as Paul and Randa were saying, it was not coordinated with the Europeans. Now that the Europeans have their own equivalent of a Magnitsky Act or something close to that, we can get some coordination. President Biden is going to be much closer to the Europeans. He will coordinate with them insofar as Middle East policy is concerned. And then I think the politicians in Lebanon will feel the bite. And particularly as you start getting perhaps the beginning of a dialogue with Iran and telling Iran, you've got to hold Hezbollah back and let's get the reform agenda moving in Lebanon. So that can be a very positive note moving forward into 2021.
Okay. I want to take one of the questions from the audience. Sorry, Nasser, this one's for you. Do you feel any sense of responsibility for the Ponzi scheme that you alleged earlier, given that you were also part of the central bank?
No, I wasn't around. I wasn't around. I was there up till 2012. The Ponzi scheme happened much later. It started in 2015, 2016 with the bailout of the banks. So nothing to do with any of that. Had I been there, I would have put a stop to it.
Okay. There are a couple of comments about the fact that people's pensions are, disappearing. We're coming back now to the reality on the ground, a reality that all the kind of international relations does impact on. But from that perspective, looking forward into 2021, we should expect to see a lot of citizen anger, you would assume. Paul, you touched upon this in your opening remarks. I have a question. Where is the opposition? What are they doing? What kind of realistic prospect is there for 2021 that we see an organized political opposition that has some chance at displacing the political class in the existing political class in Lebanon, which has been slandered all over by our panel today? I'm gonna who'd like to answer that one? Paul, would you like to have it?
I wouldn't mind taking a stab at it. Yeah. What's important to look at in the last 30 years is partly because of the sectarian distribution of power and political identities, but also for other reasons. There were a bunch of parties that went in and out of power, but there has been no actual opposition, no national opposition to the basic oligarchic rule. More than that, the upper classes, if you want to call them the bourgeoisie, the banking systems, the business elites, many of them, not so much the manufacturing and others, but the financial elites, as well as the middle class, and I would say even the working or non-working class, they were kind of integrated and going along politically, I would say, with this sectarian political class. And even as long as the economy didn't crash until recently, there was some growth and so on, there wasn't any major opposition. The opposition began to emerge in Beirut in the beginnings of the You Stink movement and so on, and really arrived only last year. So it's the beginnings of an awakening that the citizenship of its various classes realized after 30 years that going along with this status quo, re-electing the same people, has brought them to ruin. Now, it's only been 14 months since this started. Yes, okay, you can say the uprising, sometimes called the Hirak, sometimes the revolution, has done a lot. It's brought down two governments. It's brought forward a new national voice. on the critical side, you can say they haven't been united. They haven't put forward a major, new leaders. But when I looked at 2021, I link it to 2022, as I did, and to the pandemic, that the population is going to be much worse off in the summer of 2021 than it is today. They're going to be angrier, hungrier, more fed up. And as the pandemic ebbs, I do expect an explosion of going on the streets. And I think this time it might be productive in the sense that it will be linked to elections. And I think one big demand of the protests that should begin in the summer is don't let the oligarchy postpone the elections. And that needs to be absolutely part of the international conditioning. Because they want to postpone the elections. They know they're going to have major losses. So I hope that there will be a lot of movement towards the second half of 2021. There's a lot on the shoulders of the Hirak opposition and so on to coordinate better, to put forward serious candidates, not only for parliament, but eventually for prime minister, for president. We need a new ruling, I don't want to call it a class, but new rulers. And so that's what if I want to be hopeful, that's what I look for.
I just want to point out another thing from on the ground, which is I think that the ebbing of protests has not only been about the coronavirus pandemic, but also the violence with which people were met when they went to the streets last time. And from a perspective of you all have a very international perspective here. Emile, I want to ask you this question about the violence that has been meted out to protesters. Is there anything that the international sorry, I don't like using the term international community because it's a bit vague, but is there anything that like Lebanon's donors, its donors to its army, to its internal security forces can do to stop that happening? Because if that goes on again, I don't think you're going to see lots and lots of protesters going down to the streets.
Well, I mean, this is where I differ with Paul. I mean, first, to answer your question directly, Chloe, yes, there is something that donor states can do. The US, the UK, the French, and others are the primary supporters of the security services, external ones, and they can condition that. They can make sure that the military and the ISF and so on are not the recipients of funds. They can consider using Magnitsky and others as well against senior members of security forces that are implicated in dodgy dealings and may have a role in the repression. But my point is that whether we like it or not, the violence by the state, whether it's physical violence or other types of violence, has been quite effective in demoralizing the protesters so far. And as the country crumbles into more misery and pain and so on, I'm not that sure that we will see the kind of integrated popular movement with a real political agenda ahead of itself. My fear is the opposite, is that as people become hungrier and so on, the existing political class will be the sole providers of order, security, goods, whatever services are left in the country, and they will be able to solidify their control over small segments of the population, but enough to perpetuate their rule, while the others are essentially fending for themselves in the most difficult of circumstances. People usually rise up with real revolutionary ideals and so on, not when they're starving, but when they're actually doing a bit better than that. And I fear that Lebanon may be going too far in that direction. I'm happy that Paul, is the optimist here, and certainly in 2021 we'll be all watching the political dynamics inside the country. But we have to be careful to always understand that the existing players have an edge in everything, in elections, in competing for the resources of the state, over violence, whether it's through the state or through their own means. And there will be a need for what Dr. Saidi has spoken about, which is an international community that is willing to punish. And keep in mind one thing: Lebanese politicians, they're not like Syrian politicians. They want to travel to Europe, and they send their sons and daughters abroad, and they've bought the fancy apartments and so on. They're much more vulnerable than other political classes in the region, and they may be much more exposed to than we think.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to come to a close now, and we're going to be joined by Maha, Yahya in just a second. But just to wrap up, I think we've heard some very interesting analysis on the kinds of economic reforms that would need to happen. Difficult, deep, tough to do. The fact that international community might be expected to be almost coercive in the kinds of measures that it would use in order to enforce some of these reforms, because there's so little confidence here amongst the panel that the Lebanese politicians would be able or willing to do them themselves. We've heard about the withdrawal of some regional forces from being interested in Lebanon and feeling that their investments didn't go anywhere when it came to Lebanese politicians. But we've also heard that the French continue to want to be involved, and that the US may also be able to play a positive role. I think it's good that the panelists have disagreed on some things, because this is certainly not something straightforward, and there's a lot of differing views. So thank you for bringing so many interesting and insightful points of view to the panel tonight. And with that, I'll hand over to Maha. Thank you all very much for listening.
Chloe, thank you for a fantastic moderation of this event, and I really want to thank Paul, Emile, Randa, and Nasser for some fantastic comments. I think it was a great end to a depressing end, but a great end in terms of discussions for a very intense conference. Basically, we held our conference this year under really exceptional conditions. Globally, there's an economic contraction, a massive health crisis, and for Lebanon, where the Beirut Carnegie, the Malcolm Care Carnegie Middle East Center is based, is a country that is going through intensely difficult conditions, not just only political and economic, a massive political and economic crisis, as we just heard from our panelists, but also a senseless criminal explosion that destroyed almost half the city. So we're very proud to have been able to remain in Beirut and to reiterate and reconfirm our commitment to Lebanon. Our work at the center continues to build on the past decade and its legacy there. Over the past 2 days, we've moved from analyzing the prospects of a global renewal under a new US administration, the shifting role of regional and international powers in the region, the emerging security and economic landscape. And then today we've zoomed into the challenges of continued instability in different countries in North Africa, but also what the Abraham, what is the future hold for Palestine and Palestinians in the shadow, and the Arab-Israeli peace process and the shadow of the Abraham Accords. Many of these will impact Lebanon, as we just heard from our last panel, both positively and negatively. But most importantly, I think for the region, we're looking at a region where there is a new emerging security and economic landscape. But this is all happening even as people continue to take to the street, often in spite of the ongoing pandemic. This year, 2021, marks the 10th anniversary of the Arab uprisings, or the Arab Spring. And where the fundamental inequities that brought people to the street a decade ago have yet to be addressed. So I want to end on a perhaps hopeful note that the region's citizens, perhaps in 2021, will be able to carve out the beginnings of a better decade. And here is to hopefully welcoming you all in Beirut next year. Thank you so much to everybody, every panelist, and every member of the audience who joined us over the past 2 days. Thank you.